interesting, but the point that you made earlier, I think, about the study is also something that we should keep hold of, because there have been several references during the day to the way in which studies seem to have had an influence. I mean, that's something to be quite optimistic about. Hold on to. Yeah.
Tricia Barnett from Tourism Concern. I hadn't intended to talk about this, and I don't know if it's the right sort of thing, so tell me if I'm wrong. But we've recently got together a group of tour operators, small and medium-sized ones, rather than James kind, which is one of the short to be two biggest ones in the country. But we've got together the littlest and the medium-sized ones, and we now have an ethical tour operators group. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment, which might be of interest to people, is in fact tour operators themselves doing social impact assessments before they sign up the contracts with hotels. So we've actually not yet piloted it properly, we're about to, and the tour operators are prepared and actually want to work together on this. So that just might be of interest. And of course it's very much around foreign poverty.
Would anybody else who hasn't spoken like to me? Yes. No categories now, anybody's free, including David.
Oh. Elizabeth Prompton. I think I haven't spoken before because I haven't been sure which category I was in.
Sorry about that.
I think probably most people in this room know the magazine Green Hotelier. And those of us with an interest in environmental issues in tourism have been greatly helped by learning of best practice around the world in the environmental field. Green Hotelier was also beginning to branch out into social issues. But what we've heard today is lots of examples of best practice in one way or another of dealing with social issues or directly with pro-poor tourism. And I think that it's up to some entrepreneur, perhaps here present, to begin to issue something of the same order of Green Hotelier, but pro-poor hotelier, or whatever one wants to call it, which could reach governments, the private sector, and local communities. If one could produce something that coordinated all this experience and it were just to be distributed to all the different layers within the tourism hierarchy or structure, this would have an enormous impact. It can't be too technical a journal, and I think the attraction of Green Hotelier is its simplicity, its directness, but its great practical information that it provides.
Who else would like to put any further good examples on the table? David?
Richard Devon again. It's just a sort of general observation. I think picking up one or two points made earlier, I think the whole issue of the relationship between the, particularly in the hospitality sector, of the local managers on the ground in relation to the sort of head office of larger companies, and what degree of freedom they have to make choices in terms of how they operate, particularly in relation to supply chain issues and the acquisition of local produce and so on and so forth. I think there's really a very big area here, and certainly in relation to some of the experiences I've had in talking to hotel managers and food and bev managers in the hotels and so on. Some of them have a lot of flexibility, and where they have that and where they have a sort of a link with the local community, they've been doing very, very good things, and in some cases that's been slightly inhibited by their headquarters policy. And in other cases you can find it the other way around, where in fact talking to local hotel managers, they've tended to be sort of digging their heels in, and probably the companies had a slightly more, a slightly different and more pro-poor attitude. So I think that whole sort of relationship between the local decision making and the higher level decision making, and who's actually taking those decisions, is something very important that we possibly need to understand a little bit more. I would like to ask Caroline at some point in relation to the work that you were doing on the measurement of impact, particularly the indirect side, whether when you were trying to obtain the figures about the the extent to which there was local supply and so on, whether that gave you any greater feeling about how easy it might be to change practice in the areas where you're doing research, and whether we've got some more coming out from that.
Caroline, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, we could take that one just quickly now. On to take Luang Prabang, on the agricultural side, we didn't go into the whole issue in depth, certainly not as much depth as I would like to have done, given the big numbers that came out. But the few people we did talk to said, yes, local fruit and veg is used when it's in season, but no one is working with farmers to help them to extend their season, and therefore for the rest of the year it comes from Thailand. So an obvious first thing to explore with the agricultural side was to see if that kind of extension help would work and could help deliver it. So clearly there was potential. On the craft side, the raw materials were all local already, including even the silver, which is the Hmong people have old French silver coins which I'm afraid are being melted down for the silver work, as well as all the grass and the natural dyes and the sericulture and everything is local. So there's no potential to change the percentage, but obviously you can expand the craft sector more. I think on the agricultural side, perhaps the better work evidence comes from Gambia, where John already mentioned, I think Harold mentioned as well, the Gambia is good work, which is increasing incomes of a certain number of farmers, and shows that, or suggests that if you could extend that to more people, you can deliver results.
Yeah. I don't know where this idea came from, that academics talk longer than anybody else. You better get a stopwatch out for me. I've got 2 or 3 points. First one, very briefly. Laughing doesn't count. The first one for Kate, and maybe she can answer it later. I was staggered when I thought I understood her to say that the market in Siem Reap wasn't sufficient to be able to develop backward linkages. Because I know it's 1.25 million people coming in there a year, and nearly all that produce comes from Siem Reap rather than from the hinterland, as I understand it. And I did ask questions in the market, so maybe you could develop that. And I'd like to see, before saying it's the best piece from Topaz, I'd like to see the methods that we use in the study and so on. Secondly, not necessarily good practice, but actual practice. There's a paper outside on the table about some work that I did with a colleague in Laos to show exactly how successful small-scale private sector hoteliers and guest houses were in southern Laos, which compares very favourably with some of the donor-assisted projects elsewhere in Laos. And I think, in many respects, they actually do show good practice. Third thing, transnationals and employment. The evidence that is available, as in my estimation, is that transnationals actually pay better than other companies, that they pay for longer, and they have better conditions of employment. There are exceptions to this, of course. And finally, as Jane knows very well, we have been trying to work together with First Choice of ODI to work on the impact of First Choice hotels and so on in some of their destination areas, and I cannot tell her how glad we are that we're going to be able to do it. Thank you very much.
That's pretty good, yeah. I'm impressed. Anybody else like to contribute still on sort of examples of practice? I think we're beginning to run out of steam on that. What I'd like to suggest is that we've got a few areas of concern coming out of this. I mean, it seems to me that in terms of one of our exam questions, how do we bring pro-war tourism approaches into mainstream tourism? I think we can learn a little bit from this conversation. We had a lot of emphasis this morning on the discretionary spending, on the intersectoral links. I think what we're beginning to hear this afternoon is that market demand is very important, and we need to very much understand the impulses coming from demands in the market. That the private sector can be very innovative, partly because it's responding to those market signals, but partly because it's also responding to concerns, you know, as are being expressed in this room. And then lots of practical ideas about sitting with hotel operators and making things work differently. And one of the questions in the back of my mind is, who are the actors involved there? And I mean, clearly There are NGOs doing that, researchers can do that, studies can be influential, but at the moment it's sort of spots on a landscape. It's not particularly joined up, it's not particularly to scale. So one of my questions, in a way, to the panel and to those of you who've come up with these good suggestions is how can some of those approaches go a little bit more to scale? We've been reminded that this is an international industry and a very dynamic industry. Do we have the right sort of linkages across the Atlantic, for example? Are these discussions, are there the right sort of fora in which these discussions can be held? I mean, maybe there are, maybe it's a little bit segmented, some people dealing with conservation and sustainability, some people dealing more with the social issues. Is there a need to join up some of those discussions in some sort of a bigger forum? The suggestion of a magazine, I mean, that's a very practical, down-to-earth suggestion. Is it indeed the right time to have a magazine focusing on these issues? And then there are some concerns. I heard a concern on the sort of health and safety side. There's a bit of caution there. There are all sorts of legal responsibilities that companies, large and small, have to satisfy. And I don't think that the debate that we're having here is really addressing those concerns. Does it need to? Is that a critical precondition, in a sense, for scaling up some of the sorts of initiatives that we're talking about? And the question about who decides, and this room for manoeuvre, I think, was a really interesting one. And clearly that's going to vary from company to company and situation to situation. How do we take that into account? It's very clear in government often who decides. Perhaps rather less clear in the private sector who decides, and maybe very varied. So those are there are obviously things that we can do. There are approaches, but there are questions about the scaling up of those approaches. And maybe that's where the large companies come in, actually. I mean, maybe the company is the vehicle for the scaled up initiative, and perhaps there's no escaping that. And these questions about concerns, health and safety and so on, I don't know if perhaps this is the time to bring the panel back into the discussion and see if they've got any thoughts to throw on light to shed on some of these issues or some of the contributions that have come from the floor. Can we just go around? Yeah.
I'll just quickly respond to David's question on the study. I was actually referring to a study New Zealand Aid did a couple of years ago, and it was looking more at vegetables for the high-end tourism market. And effectively they found that actually most of them are brought in. There's very few vegetables grown in Cambodia at the moment. That the size of the market was about 3.1 million a year, whereas Phnom Penh would be about 36.5 million per year. So let's have more detailed discussions up, but that's where that came from. Coming back to your question just now, and I think picking up on some of the questions around linking the private sector, from a lot of my role is facilitating the dialogue between the private sector in country and the government, and specifically raising the issues and constraints that the businesses trying to operate in tourism in Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos have, given the lack of institutional frameworks in place. And I think if we're serious about impact at scale, we have to start with the big numbers. So who are the major segments coming in what form are they coming in, how are they engaging? So it's pointless deciding we want to look at ecotourism or this or that. We have to look at what the market is doing, and then we have to be talking to the major players. So I think, let's start from the big numbers, and then involve the big players involved, and that's going to be private sector and public sector.
The part of the bank that I work in is private sector development, ironically. I guess the challenge for PSD is that our dialogue and the lending that comes through this part of the bank is directed at government. And what we are trying to do, I think, and Bhuvan might be able to, he also works in the same department but in another part of the bank. No. Yeah. Yes, at the moment. Okay. So, but the challenge is to try and convert private sector needs into public sector policy action, and it's a very fine line. Private sector usually asks for a lot more than the government can give. The private sector is often very fragmented at a sort of destination level. There are so many different players and different stakeholder groups. Government often throws up its hands and doesn't know who to talk to, how to sort of galvanize what is it you really want from us. You want less tax, you want incentives for this. It's very, very, very difficult issue. But I like the approach suggested or at least talked about earlier, where maybe some of the bigger operators sit down with their local suppliers, their local ground handlers, and sort of go around government in a sense. And I think making space for that to happen. And that's certainly going to happen in Ethiopia. It's already happening in other countries. I work in Kenya is a good example. But in Ethiopia, there are no foreign companies directly operating in Ethiopia. So the challenge there is to make stronger linkages between the local ground handlers and international operators. But I'm not really going anywhere with that, but
just a couple of very quick thoughts. I think with the independent sector, you have to go to the destination because there's nowhere else to go. So I think that's where a lot of the analyses that we've done have been, because it's mainly independent travel, and so that's where you can catch tourists and the service providers. I think the consequence of wanting to upscale, and from our point of view in ODI, that means upscale number of poor people whose livelihoods we're affecting, is I think inevitable that you move up the value chain itself of tourism. And certainly with the work in the Gambia, which is largely a package destination, I realised that probably most of the decisions, or many of the decisions that influenced my study, were actually being made in an office in south of Hampshire, which has the tour operator that sends about 25% of the tourists to the Gambia. And it's actually decisions being made there that then play out in the Gambia that are really important in terms of negotiations with local suppliers. And so the consequence of wanting to upscale your poverty impact is that if you're serious about it, even now, still half of tourism in the UK is in the package sector, and you need to be working with the large tour operators. And for instance, last week I was working with the Federation of Tour Operators in Turkey, and you suddenly find that suppliers are very, very interested in what you say if you're under a banner of the Federation of Tour Operators that sends 13 million out of the 19 million people that left Britain last year on the package tour. They become extremely interested in what you say under an FTO banner, because they purchase their services. And so we were talking in Turkey, which doesn't have the best sort of corporate social responsibility record, to rooms full of 100 people that were kind of hanging on every word, both on the environmental and on the social side, because it was their client who was talking. And so suddenly you find that those coordination problems are ironed out if you kind of follow the value chain. I think the pressure is actually on us because tour operators are clear that the source market's changing, and they want to influence what's happening at the destination. And I think the challenge is really on us to be able to stand up in front of a room full of suppliers, ground handlers, hotel managers and be able to offer very practical advice, as environmentalists have been doing for years, about how you can reduce your consumption of energy and how you can conserve water. How in a very practical way, as was being said in the example of Nicaragua, you know that a holiday village is being planned. What practical things can be done to increase the pro-poor impact of that? And so I think that the market's kind of changed around us, and there's a great demand for those kind of skills. And I think that the environmentalists have got it right. I think the pressure is on us now to be able to provide the advice that will allow people to do the right thing.
They do.
Just to sort of expand on that, where we got to in the Bamboo study is actually now putting together a consortium of different players, both NGOs, including some private sector key players, because clearly once you look at the potential and what the interventions need to be, you need to have the right people playing to their strengths. It's very early days at the moment, but John and I, for example, who are both have interest in tourism in the Mekong, you know, John Mitchell came to a workshop I think we had in November last year with SNV and GTZ and IFC and ODI obviously, to look at how can we start the thinking to look at where we are today with the view that actually we should all be focused on the same objective, so that particularly within the donor agencies we have a bigger collective impact. And I think obviously where there's key private sector players, we need to bring them as well, and perhaps some other people in the room. So that's certainly our vision of how it's headed, and that we need to be presenting a much more coherent view to governments and a more single voice, and then playing to our strengths. There's plenty of work, we don't need to compete, so let's head in the same direction.
Yes. Just a very little sharing that at the beginning of the project in Da Nang, we have to make our choice on, say, whether to go mass research with qualitative and quantitative research, or either go to a quick participatory research, which will end up with kind of very, within only 2 weeks, and we will have kind of few very feasible proposal, or either go to the mass research, which lasts for 4 months or half a year, and then end up with very good, sophisticated report, and then nothing will have been done in the field, because not only our project, but I believe that in many other programs, time is limited and resources limited too. So concerning the impact to the local, we decided to choose to go to the other way, taking a very short research within 2 weeks, and then go implementing the proposal. And up until now, we are not sure that whether the proposal we are implementing is having the best impact on the poor or not. But at least we know that they are there, they are implemented, and the poor have some part of the impact on that. That's what I want to share.
Thank you all very much. I think we're due a cup of tea or coffee or juice or whatever now. It's been a very rich discussion. Thanks all very much. We're going to come back and have another very short panel, and then try and draw the different threads that we've been exploring today together in the last session. Thanks.
You ready? Recording.
Welcome to the Overseas Development Institute. The ODI is one of Britain's foremost think tanks, and it's here that nearly 100 tourism brains, academics, people from development banks, consultants, are gathered together to discuss pro-poor tourism, to see whether the travel industry can help in eradicating poverty on a global basis. So we'll see what happens.
Go.
Right, we're ready. Welcome to the Overseas Development Institute. The ODI is one of Britain's foremost think tanks, and it's here that nearly 100 of the tourism industry's brightest brains, academics, consultants, people from development banks and from tour companies are gathered to see if it is possible for tourism to contribute to helping poor people get better benefits from the tourism industry and in a way to eradicate poverty globally. We hope it's possible, and we shall see from the discussion today that will be taking place. Thank you.